Hello, welcome to the Sharp Angles podcast. I am Dan Pizzuta, joined here by Rich Hribar. Before we get into your rankings, what were some of your big takeaways of what we've seen from wide receiver production over the past couple of years?
And we've seen wide receivers kind of bounce back here the last couple of years, and now we knew we would come back down to earth a little bit from that 2020 season. I did an article a couple weeks ago just kind of explaining what exactly went into that 2020 season that was unique and paired with the kind of, trend of offensive explosion that we've been anyways. It was just kind of like the supreme cocktail of creating the highest scoring season in NFL history. We remove a couple of those elements last year, like the penalties, the home field advantage, all those things. And we see a little bit of recoil, but the numbers are still really high last year for offenses, and in particular wide receivers who had like a little bit of like a 2 or 3 year lull. Where running backs were getting used in the passing game, which also coincides with like scoring kind of dipping a little bit in recent years, like the 2017 season, especially where running backs were used their heaviest in the passing game, wide receivers are lowest. Then, hey, guess what? Then that happens. You get a lot of bad offense. So we kind of moved away from that a little bit. Wide receivers are kind of surging. We've had the big like kind of explosion of like 3 and 4 wide receiver sets on the field. Now 4 wide receiver sets still have kind of a long way to go until we get there. But, teams are now using basically 3 or more wide receivers on 75% of all pass plays. Whereas you just go like a decade ago, it was basically, 2/3 of the time instead of 3/4. So it's a big significant gap there. We just have more wide receivers, and in turn, since they're on the field more, productive and producing fantasy points, which has kind of lowered the kind of leverage that like top wide receivers have given you. Like if you look at like the share of production from like wide receiver ones in fantasy in context of the position itself, that has kind of waned a little bit. Now we just did have Cooper Kupp last year kind of break that door down. He's been kind of the outlier amongst the recent sample. We'll see if someone can put together a season like that again. But basically, yeah, all those things are in the article. I even talked about Cooper Kupp and how historic his season was and some of the regression that we could expect and how much of an outlier it was in that article as well. But yeah, just a top-down look at the usage of the wide receiver position as a whole, because that sets the foundation for us when we look at these positions. It gives us a nice little footing, understanding context of when some of these numbers drop or go up, how did the league play that year, and just kind of looking at things like that.
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the interesting things when we kind of saw how wide receiver production it did bounce back, and we're seeing like so many guys, like you said, have been able to really produce, and it's one of those things where like it kind of like how we've talked about the draft class, where it's going to be hard to like draft a bad wide receiver. Like, and that's kind of the case in fantasy too. It feels like it feels like you're going to have to try really hard this year to like not have a good wide receiver core if you're drafting correctly, at least.
Yeah, I mean, you just get to basically like running back maybe like 12 or 13, and you start to have the questions. Then when you get to like running back 25, 30, you start to have a lot of questions, and you're really relying at hope. But when you're in the wide receivers and you're even at like wide receiver like 55, wide receiver 60, you're like, this is a pretty good player. Like there's a definite avenue here where you're not just selling yourself on opportunity. You're saying like, yeah, this is an actual productive NFL player, vice versa, when we're talking about taking like Marlon Mack or something like that.
So this is as someone who is obviously not as big into fantasy and knowing what I'm doing as you are. Every year in the Scott Fish Bowl, which just got the invite for this year, I find myself being in that position where it's round like an 8 or 9, and I see a wide receiver and like coming at it from like a real football perspective. I was like, oh, this guy's still really good. Like, I'm obviously taking Odell Beckham over Marlon Mack. Like but like those are the choices that you have to make. And usually I end up with a roster that has very bad running backs because I'm waiting till like round 18 to take one. But that is like, I can't get my mind around that. So that's kind of, it is where we are with wide receivers in a lot of drafts. And you kind of have to like reset yourself there a little bit when you're figuring out. And I have not been able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, you still look at it from like a positional leverage stance. Like you hint upon it earlier. That just so much of your league has production at the wide receiver position. Now, granted, you're going to have some teams that run into injuries and they have like limited wide receiver positions in season. But when you look at just from a like like from a leverage stance, the baseline of the wide receiver position still produces so much more tangible output to the top of the position compared to running back. I mean, that's why running backs still, even though there's so few and it's such a scarcity, those guys, when you get them in season, they just create so much positional leverage because the field at the position is just so poor, especially when we get in season. I mean, even last year, you look at, if you didn't have Austin Eckler combat Jonathan Taylor, I mean, then the gap was just plummeted down there. Now, we did have Cooper Kupp last year, who basically was the first player, wide receiver, to like lead in like fantasy war, like wins over replacement, since I've seen it like really done and calculated. So if you run into another Cooper Kupp, you're going to be good. But I'm going to say that Cooper Kupp season probably doesn't happen again this year for someone.
Yeah, like 2,000 receiving yards probably not. It was the perfect storm of like a lot of things.